Welcome to the Flourish and Purpose podcast, a podcast that will inspire, motivate, and challenge you in living your life for Christ. I'm your host, Tamika Mahomes, and on this podcast, you can expect weekly encouragement and inspiration from me, as well as other inspirational guests. Now let's dig in. Hey guys, and welcome back to today's episode of the Flourish and Purpose podcast. I'm your host, Tamika Mahomes. Before we jump into today's episode, I want to hear from you guys. I would love to hear the topics and subjects that you would like to hear me talk about here on the podcast. And to do that, I want you to simply shoot me an email at flourishandpurpose@gmail.com. Be sure to include your name, your city, your website, and your social media handles, and I'll make sure I shout you out on air. I want to thank you guys in advance because this is truly going to help me filter what topics you guys want to hear and to be able to encourage you, because that's what this podcast is all about. So today we're going to get started with today's topic, which is all about perfectionism. Did you know that we as humans are supposed to be 100% perfect all of the time? I mean, seriously. You can never mess up. You can never make mistakes. You can never be flawed. Well, I'm obviously totally joking with you guys. Well, the truth is that this is the mindset that many of us live with. We think that in order to be effective, we have to be perfect. We use this in our everyday life, and we even use it in our relationship with Christ. And while I'll be honest, I also strive to be perfect way too much. I've learned to find rest in the fact that I am an imperfect person resting in the hands of a perfect Savior. I'm going to just be honest with you guys. When I come up with most of these topics for this podcast, it's stuff that I struggle with. And I know that if I struggle with it, other people struggle with it too. And I know that being perfect is something that we all feel like we have to be. But I love that God reminds us that we don't have to be perfect because He is. The Bible reminds us of this in Romans 3:23, where it says, all have sinned and come short to the glory of God. So that means that each and every one of us fail. We all fail to reach the mark of perfection. And while to you it may not seem ideal, today I just want to tell you that your imperfections matter. Your imperfections are the very thing that make you relatable. I don't care what anybody says. No one can truly relate to someone who gives a persona of perfection. It's in our imperfections that we can show others, hey, you don't have to be perfect. I'm not perfect, and that's okay. Over the last year, I've really found myself in a position of struggling with this truth. I'm in a position of leadership, leading a church, and I was under the assumption that I had to be perfect. Why? Because people are really constantly always watching me. But I recently came to the understanding that while God does hold me to a higher standard, He does not hold me to a standard of perfection. And I've truly learned to rest in that truth. You see, I've learned that while I fall short, I need to lean on God and not on myself. And when I feel like that I'm meant to be perfect, I'm leaning into my own understanding and not the understanding of God. We all must get to a point where we understand that perfection is a human standard and it's not a God standard. Your story, your situation, your mess ups, it's what makes you you. Instead of beating yourself up about your past and the things that are making you imperfect, learn from your mistakes and use them as an opportunity to grow. Use it as an opportunity to develop, and use it as an opportunity to be more like Christ. Hey there, are you enjoying today's episode of the Flourish and Purpose podcast? Well, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you never miss an upload. Also, be sure to rate and review on iTunes. Now let's get back to today's episode. You're not perfect when you're relatable. You're perfect when you find your dependability on the one that is perfect. You're relatable when you allow your flaws to grow you into more. You see, your imperfections have a way of placing you in a position of dependency. Once you realize that you can't fix those things on your own, once you realize that you need help, you're placed in a position where you have to depend on God. And I know we like to be Mr. or Mrs. Independent, but walking with God, it's about depending on Him. It's about understanding that you need someone who was perfect to help you through your imperfections. Never get to a place where you try and self treat your imperfections. Get to a place where you allow God to help you work through your imperfections and to get better. Dependability is about growing through your imperfections. I love this passage in 2 Corinthians 12 where Jesus is talking to Paul and he says, "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." You see, it's when we're weak, when we find ourselves at a point of weakness, that we can depend on the one who is strong, that we can depend on the one who is able to turn our imperfections into perfection in Him. So we have to stop looking at our imperfections as things that hold us back. We have to stop looking at our imperfections as things that limit us. And we have to start looking at our imperfections as a time for us to depend on the one who is over our lives. So before I close, I want to recap these points. Perfectionism does not come from God. God is perfect and we are not. Our imperfections are what make us relatable. Our imperfections are what make us dependent. And dependability is all about growing through our imperfections. So today, I want you to be encouraged in knowing that your imperfections are perfect for God to work in your situation. Okay, guys, that's it for today's episode of the Flourish and Purpose podcast. If you would like today's show notes, please go to flourishandpurpose.com. I want to thank you for listening, and I'll catch you next time.